My dear brothers and sisters here at Holy Cross, we continue with the series on Paul's letter to the Romans with chapter 4, verses 6 through 8. Now I'm going to read these at the beginning because you're probably getting sick of chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. So here we go. So also David speaks of the blessedness of those to whom God reckons righteousness irrespective of works. Blessed are those whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one against whom the Lord will not reckon sin. Once again, we have some Psalms here. And remember what we said earlier in Romans about the Psalms. Why would Paul use the Psalms? Well, for a couple of reasons. We know that they were always on his lips because this is what he prayed. Two, they were on the lips of the Christian community, on the hearts and the lips of those who were the believers. This is what they prayed. Third of all, who is David? Well, David is the second king of Israel. But he's really seen as the Messiah, the great hope of Israel, the one who God has blessed to lead Israel. In many ways, he is the forebearer to Jesus. Now, Jesus doesn't take on the political and warlike nature of David. And David is highly flawed in a moral way in which Jesus is not. But Paul points to David because David plays a crucial role in the role of Israel. David, in many ways, is showing what it looks like to be in love with God, to dance before the Lord, dance before the ark. Now that enrages some of David's contemporaries. It burns them, especially Saul's wife. But the fact of the matter is, David knew something really important. David didn't become king on his own. He became king because he was anointed. He was chosen. He was the youngest son. David knows that he was chosen and that God anointed him. And that whatever he did because God gave him the strength to do it for Israel. Not for his own gain, not for his own good, but for the good of Israel. And even when David sinned, David was able to say, "You're right, I have sinned." Back up the truck, put a little sackcloth and ashes on, and try and find the yes again for God. Now, what that means is this. Paul is once again reminding the Roman Christians that he's writing to that this love affair, this story that God has for his people is rooted in something that happens before Jesus. Abraham, Moses, David, all of this is about God's love affair with humanity. Now, what he's also saying here is this. You've heard it already in the Old Testament, what God is up to. Do not think that what is happening in Jesus Christ is just new in Jesus Christ. This stuff is what God was up to before Jesus arrived on the scene. But when you look at Jesus, he would say, remember that indeed Jesus is the King of the Jews. Jesus is the temple. Jesus is the sacrificial offering in the temple. He is the prophet, the king, the priest, the offering, all rolled up into one. And so here he is Paul pointing to David, and he says, you know that David had something really important to say about Jesus. Listen to it. And he says, look, the blessedness of those to whom God reckons righteousness, irrespective of works. Why could David say that? Well, David could say that because he was made king of Israel, irrespective of how valiant he was, irrespective of how important he looked on the outside, irrespective of anything he had done before he became king of Israel. So there David is realizing, heck, blessed are those whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. You know why he says that? Because David knows that his sins have been covered. David knows that he's been forgiven. And what Paul is calling those Roman Christians to do is to realize that in Jesus Christ, regardless of their iniquities, regardless of what they've done, regardless of how petty and how broken they are, in and through Jesus Christ, God has covered their sins and brought them to righteousness. Remember, not a righteousness just between them and God or them and Jesus. It's not that private. As we said before, this is a big public yes. This is the most public of public yeses. This is God saying, get on board. Come on in. See the new creation that I am creating in you, with you, through you, because you said yes to Jesus, to God the Father. Now, all of this is to say that Paul is calling them to realize that there is no sin other than the no to God, that God can't overcome. Because God, in this story, loves us, desires us, and calls us back to him. Now, in Romans 4 through 9, Paul's going to talk a little bit more about what this blessedness means. Now, for me, sometimes blessedness can look pretty petty and pretty small. I like to think to myself that if I pray 3 times a day, that if I help an old lady cross the street, that if I go to the veterinary and help suture up a dog, I've done my good deed for the day. But the reality is that this form of blessedness is much bigger than what I would call small-time morality blessedness. What I'm talking about here is being with God and knowing that we are rooted in God and that here on earth we're rooted in God's creation. And that even things that we see through our small lens as being broken and evil, even that God has a plan for through God's redemptive act. Now, all of this is to say that Paul knows what small blessedness looks like, or small-timey blessedness looks like, because Paul would say, that's the blessedness I was chasing before Jesus popped me over the head, before Jesus said, hey, Paul, why are you persecuting me? Hey, Paul, why are you acting all righteous but condemning others? Hey, Paul, why don't you get over yourself and your small-timey morality? Your morality that would hurt others. Your morality that would put a stumbling block between others and God. Get over yourself. You're not that good because you did something. Now, the good news, as we keep coming back to, is that this isn't the Marines where you got to climb up a tall wall and you got to carry a heavy rucksack. Do you hear that, Alex Rollins? It's not the Marines, all right? So I know you can run 20 miles, and I know you can do a whole bunch of stuff. That's for you too, Trey, and you too, Jack. Yes, God is impressed with carrying a heavy rucksack for 10 miles, but ultimately, God isn't interested in that. He's interested in our heart and our yes, and the openness we have to the Spirit. And we'll continue with chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, and a little past that in our next episode. So God bless, and amen.